So on the one hand, we do have this very unique heritage in the state that I'll talk about some examples of. On the other hand, we've also been arguing about it from the beginning. Some of the most innovative things the university did quite early was as early as the 1870s and 1880s begin to offer farmers' institutes for farmers' education, mechanics institutes for industrial work that were less successful, summer schools for teachers that ultimately grew into the School of Education at Madison and other locations, and then correspondence education. In other words, using the mail for educational outreach to isolated rural and immigrant families. So on the one hand, the university was very innovative. On the other hand, those programs were chronically underfunded, which again is still very much true today. Then there was another new commitment in the early part of the 20th century, partly associated with Governor La Follette and the progressive movement in the United States, a very aggressive effort to support the university and outreach and the public schools. And this was the time that the Wisconsin idea was first articulated, in 1910, 1912 especially, began as early as 1905. And I think we all know what that is, that the boundary of the university should be the boundary of the state. Now, that's an inspiring ideal. It's been with us, very much with us since the beginning. What we often don't realize is that it was controversial at the time, and there was a backlash at the time. As the state cuts the budget for public higher education, there's kind of complicated effects of that. One, and many other public universities around the country have had to do this as well, of course, you have a strong incentive to admit more out-of-state and more international students because, of course, they pay 2 or 3 times what in-state students pay. So one of the great prides of UW-Madison and of UW system is that we really are dedicated to educating the young people of the state. But they have recently changed the rules at Madison so that we will admit the same number, raw number of in-state undergraduates, but we then removed the cap of the number of out-of-state and international students on top of that. So we can begin admitting increasing numbers of those high-paying students, which is going to, of course, change the nature of the place and the nature of education offered. What is lost in the debate about budget cuts in education, the sense is that if you cut the budget to the university, it will force the university to be more responsive, to become engaged in the economy, to be more innovative. And to some degree, I have to admit that is true, right? The university does become more aggressive in seeking out external partners, seeking out industrial research. That is true. The downside of that is that what state money actually pays for, essentially, is undergraduate education. So when you cut the state budget, the people that you're impacting are often the frontline teaching and the engagement with undergraduates. As that compels an institution like Madison to become more reliant on external grant funding, it is pulled in the direction of those external funders. In the abstract, we think public schooling is in trouble, but in the specific one we know, we think it's quite good and we admire it. And I think we often do the same thing when we talk about so many of these issues. So we, rather than really having a kind of open dialogue about budget cuts or voucher schools or vouchers or charter schools, we become partisan and we become ideological. We assume that if you adopt a certain ideological position, then vouchers will work. If you adopt the other ideological position, then vouchers cannot work. Right? And rather than having a real debate about the actual effects of vouchers or the actual effects of charter schools, we kind of retreat into our ideological corners. And I guess what we need is more dialogue like this one, more opportunities to discuss the issues. We need, frankly, better journalism, better educational journalism, and we need more effort on the part of the university and the part of the schools to kind of tell their story to the public and talk about some of these issues.
Is it possible to measure results of charter schools versus public schools?
There have been efforts to make them be accountable in the same testing regimes, but the state has been going through such upheaval about how it does testing from cycle to cycle that there's obviously a certain political faction that is trying to protect charters and voucher school from that kind of accountability. The argument for that is that they're often beginning, they're experimental, they aren't ready yet to be subjected to the same kind of testing, accountability through testing. I think a more reasonable argument would be that all schools, regardless of organizational type, should be subjected to the same accountability measures.
Just wondering what your thoughts are of having a nationalized curriculum.
The movement for national content standards was in part an attempt to say, we can no longer tolerate 50 different systems. We have to have some integrity and some content standards. And that was supported both by Republicans like Lamar Alexander, the first President Bush, and by Bill Clinton when he was governor of Arkansas. He was one of the leaders of that movement. So there was a kind of bipartisan movement around content standards. Now the problem, there were some real flashpoints about that, however. And one that I remember very vividly, because I was involved in some of it, was that there was an attempt to write national history standards. Well, what they did, though, was turn over the process earlier to academics, professional historians, and teachers around the country. And the ones they came up with were actually very positive and very, patriotic, but also very honest about issues like slavery and poverty and immigration, right? And the argument was the defenders of the National History Standard said, it's a history of freedom, but a better history of freedom, in which we are honest with the students about slavery, racism, immigration. And unfortunately, they proved so controversial, there was a huge just firestorm. One of the first kind of culture wars, explosions was around these national history standards in 1992. And the conservative media went berserk, they were unpatriotic, they didn't have enough sort of indoctrination of the Constitution, and they had too much discussion of slavery and all sorts of negative aspects of American history, and the government backed away. And it never happened. We don't have national history standards to this day. Now, in part, I think that burned by that experience, the whole content standards movement kind of bunkered down into basics, sort of very kind of basic approaches that are not going to be politically controversial.
I'd like to hear a little more about this sustainability education that you're involved in.
So this is, in fact, a remarkable movement all around the world. It's called the Green Campus Movement or the Sustainability Education Movement. There are significant commitments at the international level. What happens in the United States, there's a kind of curious disconnect in the United States. We do not have a national policy around this, partly because of obstruction from Congress, because it's politically controversial. However, that's the bad news. The good news is that remarkable work is being done in the executive agencies. So in the department, or in the Department of Defense is doing incredible work around sort of alternative energy and sustainability. Department of Energy and others, the White House, the National Science Foundation, and individual schools and individual districts are doing incredible work. So, and both public and private institutions. I'm sure some of you are familiar with the Conserve School in Land O'Lakes, which in fact is one of the most innovative, environmentally themed sustainability schools probably in the Midwest, if not the United States. There's a very innovative one in Milwaukee called Escuela Verde, which is a sort of it has a school garden. It's wrapped around something called the Center for Urban Ecology. There are movements at UW Superior, Northland College, another private institution, has an incredibly innovative sustainability program. So in the US, this is happening kind of at the grassroots level in individual schools and colleges and on campuses. And it's happening in some states where you have very ambitious state-level commitments to this, in Washington, Oregon, California, Massachusetts, Connecticut, kind of the places you might predict. It has not yet cohered up to the level of national policy the way it has in some other countries. But I would say it's coming. All right.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks to Dr. Mark Johnson.